Greetings, Gilliam the Rogue here, once again, back with a build update video. Today we are going to be talking primarily about stamina DPS and transitioning into the Clockwork City patch. Now, not a lot has changed in terms of itemization like traits, etc., because there haven't really been any big changes to them directly. However, we will be changing some of our traits and enchant/poison usage due to the shift of how Maelstrom Master and Asylum weapons operate. So previously in other patches they worked as an enchant and they had a passive bonus associated with them. If you put a poison on, you'd retain the passive bonus but you would not get the enchant. So like crit rush on the Maelstrom Greatsword. If you put poisons on, you kept that 189 weapon damage, but you lost that extra damage when you crit rush. Now, it is a set bonus, so now you can put an enchant or a poison over it. It does not have that passive bonus, but you're going to be able to retain that set bonus even if you bar swap off. So like Maelstrom Bow, Maelstrom Staff, still going to work on a back bar, but you can put an enchant or poisons on them now. And in terms of stamina DPS, this is really, really big to our advantage. And Magicka DPS too in PvE. Many PvPers are upset. It's not a complete nerf. Gaining enchants did help them a little bit in terms of burst potential, but most of them were using them for passives. Whatever, this is about PvE. So, if we look at the Maelstrom Bow, let's take off the poisons, we notice that I have an enchant on it, and that this is now a set bonus. Now again, the set bonus will persist when I bar swap. So if I cast this on this bar and then let it tick at least one time and then bar swap off, it will retain that bonus. However, if I animation cancel Endless Hail with this, sometimes it gets a little tricky. So if I cast this and I don't let it deal damage, we're going to notice it does go up, but there are some instances where I found if you animation cancel a little too quickly, yeah, like right here. So now that my Twin Fang is at max stats, notice how it was capping at 2341. So again, we'll look through this, look at the max damage. It's still critting for the same value, 2341. With the Maelstrom Bow, it should be getting higher and higher. So with this, we need to make sure that we cast, it does one tick of damage, and then we bar swap off, and notice how it keeps getting progressively stronger. 3.1k, 3.4, 3.6. It keeps getting bigger and bigger. So these enchants need to deal damage at least once, or these set bonuses need to deal damage at least once in order to apply. So if you bar swap too soon, you're going to negate them, because you're effectively casting them from a different bar. So that was the primary change with Maelstrom Bows, and this is going to change up the importance of enchants and as well as traits a little bit, primarily for stamina DPS. So before, we always ran infused on our front bar with dual wield, because dual wield bow is just the best thing for dual wield, or for stamina DPS. You can run two-hander, and even if you did run two-hander, you had it infused, because back when the Maelstrom Bow was an enchant, if you had infused on your front bar and you had bar swapped off the Maelstrom Bow, you'd still get that infused bonus. So it was indirectly buffing the Maelstrom Bow. So even if the Maelstrom Bow was, say, sharpened, and then I swapped to my front bar where I had infused, the Maelstrom enchant was like, oh, hey, he's got infused, I'm going to deal infused damage. So it was nuts in terms of damage potential. Now that it's a set bonus, that doesn't happen anymore. So infused has really come down the line. Now infused is still a very, very potent stat, and it will win in single target application. So when you're dealing nothing but target dummy damage, or you're fighting a singular boss, or all you care about is killing that big boss and you don't care about your overall DPS for adds, then infused on your main hand is still going to win because of what it enables. Infused is still bugged where it is applying to other enchants. So on my front bar, this goes to my poison enchant. It gets 30% bonus damage, that poison enchant, and it gets a 50% cooldown reduction. So instead of having a 4-second ICD, it has a 2-second ICD and does 30% bonus damage or potency. Then my offhand, even though it's not infused, while it will not get the potency, that 30% bonus to the Berserker enchant, it will get that cooldown reduction, that 50% cooldown reduction for its ICD. And a Berserker enchant usually has a 10-second ICD, so you have to wait 10 seconds before it procs again. Infused makes it 5. So our Berserker enchant isn't getting the full potency of the Infused, but it's still very, very versatile because it's affecting our poison and our Berserker enchant, allowing for a higher uptime. So it's still really, really strong. However, now that this no longer affects our Maelstrom bow, Infused has seen a dramatic decrease in terms of DPS, and now Nirnhoned on our main hand is starting to come up a lot because it enables a lot. It's going to give us AoE damage because it's going to just increase our flat weapon damage, so that'll apply to Caltrops, Arrow Barrage, Ultimates, everything in our kit that's single target or AoE. It'll also apply to healing, so if you're slotting Vigor or you have some other heal in your kit and it scales with weapon damage, gonna be even more. So it's just a very versatile setup, and I personally prefer Nirnhoned on my front hand now due to this. You can run Sharpened if you still have that. It's still very good, especially if you're solo and you don't have a lot of penetration. It'll save you some CP points, so you have a little bit more freedom in terms of how to spend those. But in terms of min-maxing, Infused for pure single target and Nirnhoned for very high diversity. So my go-to is Nirnhoned just because it's versatile. And being a good endgame player isn't about getting the best DPS on Rakat or getting the best DPS on a target dummy. It's about getting the best results in a large variety of situations. So Nirnhoned helps us do that. Then again, on our offhand, we will be running Sharpened if we are not at penetration cap, or we will be running Precise if we are at penetration cap. So those are the two traits. You don't run Nirnhoned on your offhand because your offhand gets a weapon damage penalty. Because it's in your offhand, it's weaker, you're not going to hit as hard, so it sees a cutback in terms of efficiency. So since Nirnhoned increases that weapon damage, that trait will get that efficiency slash. So we don't really want it there. Meanwhile, things like Sharpened and Precise don't matter if we're on our front hand or our offhand, so we use that there. Infused on our offhand, again, is not that good because we already get the cooldown reduction if we're running it on our main hand, and since our primary, or our main hand, usually gets precedence or priority when proccing enchants, you don't want to infuse on your offhand because then that potency bonus is only going to go to your offhand, and weapon abilities only proc your main hand enchant, not your offhand. You have to light attack for that. Usually you're attacking with your light or your main hand. So infused offhand, not a good idea. So sharp or precise. Again, sharp if you're not at pen cap, precise if you are at pen cap. Remember that penetration cap in endgame PvE, so 4-man veteran dungeons, trials, VMA, stuff like that, the cap is going to be 18,200. Now, in Maelstrom Arena, mobs will have varying, but in dungeons and trials, everything has 18,200 or 18,500 if they're resistant to that element, mainly poison or disease damage for stamina builds. So, you're going to want to have about 18k penetration, and then you can use Sharpen to get there, or if you're not there, then, or if you are there already, then use Precise. In terms of gear, nothing is really changing, so you can still run the classic 5 Twin Fang, 5 VO, 2 monster set setup. When you do that, you're going to want to have Twin Fang Snake active permanently so you never lose those stacks, and then you're going to want Vicious Ophidian jewelry and weapons. Because if you have Vicious Ophidian permanently, you're going to have better resource management, but your Twin Fang stacks, that armor penetration that you gain, is going to fail every time you swap off your bar, because it only lasts 3 seconds. And since we're on our back bar for about 4 to 6 seconds, depending on how robust your rotation is, what class you're playing is, that means it's going to fall off, and you're going to see a tremendous damage loss, and you're going to have to build them back up every time you go back. Since many dots like Trap Beast and stuff like that are static in terms of the penetration that you casted them with, they will not update. The only exclusions to this are Rending Slashes because they ignore armor, and Poison Injection will update based on it because it got a special change to do that. So things like Trap Beast or Noxious Breath or Rend or whatever you're using in terms of like a dual wield ultimate, stuff like that, it will not update. So if you cast it without full penetration from your Twin Fang, you're going to lose out on damage. So we want that on our primary. But in terms of Nightblade Templar, and sometimes Sorcerer, you're going to want to use War Machine instead of Vicious Ophidian. Now, your sustain is going to plummet, so in solo application, I don't really suggest doing this, especially if you're doing Maelstrom or you're like soloing vet content because you're trying to get gear or you're just trying to get better at the game. Vicious Ophidian is still going to be your best friend because that stamina management is vital in terms of staying alive these days. If you can get over it, then you can use War Machine, but War Machine favors static or stationary fights without a lot of movement. It does have group utility, so that's another really nice thing that you're going to want to bring something to the table, because usually stamina DPS are very selfish. They don't have anything great, so War Machine helps. But you also need a cheap ultimate, so Nightblades will be using Soul Harvest or Incap. I prefer Soul Harvest for more ulti gen, which means for War Machine. Templars will be using Radial Sweep. It's really cheap, does nice damage, has AoE. And then Sorcerers will be using Dawnbreaker because they have that ulti cost reduction, so it will help bring it down. It'll still do nice damage, but War Machine is going to work best on Stamina Nightblade and Stamina Warden, I guess, too, if you're using the Bear, and then Stamina Templar. So those are the 3 suggestions for that. And then again, if you are not one of those, so like you're a Dragon Knight, you can use a different set. So Vicious isn't that great for DKs because they heavy attack. They don't have a spammable, so sustain isn't an issue for them, right? So they can use other sets like Poisonous Serpent because they deal a lot of poison damage. They get amps to it. They don't really have a lot of options in terms of jewelry. Otherwise, they can use like 5 Twin Fang Snake, 3 jewelry, 2 body pieces, and then another 5-piece like Hunding's Rage on their dual wield bar. You have a lot of options in terms of how you set this up, but that's for solo stuff, right? But once we get into group compositions, our gear is going to change. So in group compositions, we're going to want to run War Machine even more because more group utility. That 15% damage is really strong. You and 2 nearby allies, you have to make sure you're sticking close to your stamina buddies or melee or magic DPS as well, so that it doesn't go to tanks and healers, so you don't waste that efficiency. But since we're going to be in a group, Twin Fang goes out the window because there are more efficient sets, such as Night Mothers or Sunderflame. So usually in a raid group or in a 4-man situation, instead of running selfish DPS, if you have more than 1 stamina DPS, you're going to want to run enabling sets like Night Mother's Gaze, Morag Tong, and Sunderflame. Those are the 3 big ones in terms of enabling DPS. So in terms of where they fall, Sunderflame works best on a Stamina Templar because they do the least DPS other than Warden in terms of Stamina DPS, and they have to heavy attack a lot. So you put the enabling set on the weakest class, so you see the least amount of power loss, and then that redistribution that, hey, I'm giving you my allies all of this armor pen, they get a really big boost. So overall, you have a larger gain. You could put it on a Stamina Dragon Knight too, but since a Stam DK does more DPS than a Stamina Templar, that redistribution of power kind of evens out, and it's like, okay, now the Stamina Templar gets more DPS, but since the Stam DK already would be beating him, it makes more sense to put Sunderflame on the Stamplar. So he does, yeah, less DPS, but then that Stamina Dragon Knight does even more. So that redistribution of power when put on the weakest class is more efficient because it buffs the stronger. So I prefer it on a Stamina Templar. But again, if you don't have a Stamplar in your group, then you can put it on a Stam DK or a Stam Sork because they do a lot of heavy attacks. Stam Nightblade, not so much because we have Leeching Strikes. We have a really, really strong spammable. Other classes really don't, other than the Stamina Templar. So we're going to stick with us. Stamplar doesn't have as good resource management. They don't have, like, no stamina version of Channeled Focus. Repentance is useless in boss fights for the most part. Stuff like that, so they have to heavy attack more. Then we get to Night Mother's Gaze, and Night Mother's Gaze works best on a Stamina Sorcerer or a Stamina Nightblade. I prefer it on a Stam Sork because they're going to still be critting considerably. Stamina Nightblade usually beats Stam Sork in most situations in terms of what they're enabling because, like, War Machine and whatnot, so I put that on the Stam Sork because the Nightblade is going to be doing higher single target damage. However, some Stam Sorks can beat Stam Nightblade, so put it on whoever is doing the least DPS. Same idea as Sunderflame. Since Nightblades crit a little bit more, if you're worried about that uptime, you can put it on a Nightblade, but since Night Mother's Gaze applies a 6-second debuff, it's really, really strong. So, again, remember, Twin Fang if you're solo or you don't have any other Stam Bros in group. Otherwise, use Night Mothers and Sunder between the two of you. Now let's talk a little bit about weapon optimization. So 2 daggers will win in most situations. Now on pure single target, 1 axe, 1 dagger will win because that twin blade and blunt bleed will proc only on 1 target because it's every time you deal direct damage, stuff like that. It doesn't proc on dots, it doesn't proc on AoEs, it only procs on single target. So that's only going to be good on single target. So if you're looking for a really good boss fight where you're trying to kill him as soon as possible, axe going to be strong. But if you're doing a fight where there's lots of adds and they need to die, then 2 daggers is going to be better. So I usually prefer 2 daggers, especially as a Nightblade, because we get that crit hit damage amp, so that crit bonus goes up. So that's really, really strong. Again, axes and AoE are very, very weak. I never suggest doing it, only if you're going in single target. So 2 daggers is preferred. Bow. So we talked a lot about optimization for gear and whatnot, and then again a 2-piece monster set. So Krags for single target, Valijeth for cleave, and Mephalas for massive AoE damage. So Mephalas is better fitted on, again, classes that do heavy attacks. So like a Stam Dragonite, it's poison damage, it's AoE, so it gets buffed by World and Ruin. Stuff like that, so it's really strong on them. But Valijeth is still usually the preferred setup because you don't have to worry about over penetrating. It does really nice damage, it has cleave potential. Krags is really, really good for pure single target with a boss that isn't moving a lot. It helps that armor penetration so that you can have a little bit more points from your CP system put into raw damage instead of armor pen. So it's still really good. Otherwise, you can, instead of using 2-piece Krags, is you can put War Machine active on your front or on your body. You'll lose the capability to run 5-1-1 if you're running Twin Fang and War Machine because you can't get heavy or light of those. But then you can put Master Daggers on your front bar. So Master Daggers have gotten a tremendous buff this patch. But unlike a monster set, they don't have a 2-piece bonus. It's only a 1-piece bonus. And when we look at this tooltip, it does 17-16 damage every 0.4 seconds for 1.2 with a 3-second cooldown, so it's up a lot. This is just 1500 damage every 2 seconds. So a monster set is usually going to beat Master Daggers, but in terms of situations where a boss is moving too much and you don't have that luxury of standing still or cleaving or whatever, then Master Daggers will win because you can just put Twin Slashes on. Oh, he jumps across the room, no big deal. He's still getting that massive damage spike from the Master Daggers. So I do suggest going to get those for many situations like Asylum Sanctorum. The boss jumps around a lot. You can use it in other areas like Halls of Fabrication where bosses are moving. It's still very, very powerful, but do keep in mind that if you are using 2 drop sets like Twin Fang and War Machine, that you'll lose that 5-1-1. Your health will be very, very low. See, I'm at 15k. I don't have Ebon or Worm, so in a raid situation, I'd have about 17k. I don't have any points into health. I don't have any health enchants. And that's in 5-1-1. So if I was in 7 medium, this would be about 14k. So your health is going to be super low if you do that, and you're going to have to put points into health or use an enchant or rely on your group mates with Ebon and Warhorn. So do keep that in mind. So still stamina enchants on everything. Again, if you do need health, you can put that there. All divines, we're going to still be running the Warrior Mundus Stone. You can use Lover if you're solo and you're not hitting penetration cap. Usually I don't like Lover. It's very cheesy. It's not going to be viable in most situations because you're going to be hitting penetration cap anyways much more readily thanks to CP, sharpened in your offhand, debuff sets, etc. However, if you do play solo or you play in a group that isn't well optimized, you can use Lover. It will win in terms of damage production unless you're using a lot of bleed damage because bleeds ignore armor penetration because they do true damage. So, I usually stick with Warrior. It's very strong. It's going to be buffed by Major and Minor Brutality. It'll work even better on a Templar because they get passive weapon damage bonuses, stuff like that. So it's still really, really good. Otherwise, Lover is also a solid setup. On classes, most of the time we'll be using Dubious Cameron Throne unless we're playing a heavy attack build like a Stamina Dragonite. sometimes Stamsork and sometimes Stamplar. You'll use blue food on them because since you're not really using a spammable, you want to heavy attack more. So you don't need that stam regen. So you can use blue food. Your health will be way higher. You'll have more stamina. Everything will be great. However, for Stamina Nightblade and classes that do actively use a spammable or builds that actively use a spammable, you need to be able to sustain, and Dubious Throne is the best way of doing so. So we'll be using that. And then for consumable potions, again, using weapon power pots, major brutality, major savagery, and a massive influx of stamina. Really, really strong. So we covered traits on that. The one thing that I have not talked about yet is our Maelstrom Bow. So, in terms of traits for our back bar, Nirnhoned will win in almost all situations. Sharpened is a optional setup if you have very low penetration. However, after about 14,000 pen, Sharpened starts to lose to Nirnhoned in terms of back bar operations, just because Nirnhoned will go to our front bar with our single target dots. So remember how some dots retain the stats that they're casted with? Primarily Trap Beast for the Nightblade because AoE dots will update when you bar swap and Poison Injection will update when you bar swap. But Trap Beast does not. It retains its stats that it's casted with. So if you cast this with higher weapon damage and swap off, it's going to do the same damage. So you cast it with Nirnhoned and it's going to get that huge power spike. So that's why Nirnhoned on our back bar is usually preferred. And in terms of enchants, you can use an enchant. However, since we're using Poison and Berserker here, there's not many things that are very strong. If you want to save money, you can use a Disease enchant or an Absorb Stamina enchant. Disease will give you a little bit extra damage. Absorb Stamina will give you tiny bit of damage and resource management. However, Absorb Stamina and Magic enchants are really weak. I would love to see a buff to them to make them more viable. So, since that is the case, we have two meh enchants. We are now using poisons on our back bar. The damage health poisons, they are disgusting. If we look at this, it does 1671 poison damage every 1 second, and then another 1085 every second for 6. So we're getting a lot of damage out of this. These can crit. They're going to scale with CP. They're going to use weapon damage to crit, armor penetration because they're poison damage. So let's quick load a fight with this. So here it is. I did 50k on my Stamina Nightblade on Gilliam. I had like rank 1 in cap and I was using Dawnbreaker of Smiting. It wasn't optimal, but I broke 50k, and when we look at the poisons, the part 1 of the poison, the Creeping Ravage health, did 1600 DPS, and then the second part did 631 DPS. So it's breaking 2k DPS. It's pretty much as strong as our poisoned weapon enchant. It's very, very powerful. And then in a group, it's going to get even stronger if you have someone running Morag Tong, because Morag Tong makes a target take 10% more poison damage. So these poisons become even more disgusting. So it's really, really powerful. It's going to be your best back bar option, but it is very expensive because they run out like crazy. They're proccing every 10 seconds because you have so many weapon attacks with between Endless Hail, Light Attacking, Poison Injection, Rending Slashes. All these things can proc it, so it's proccing like mad. So now let's go to the Alchemy Station and I can show you how to make these. So you're going to be using Alkahest. We'll be using Nirnroot, Nightshade, and then one more. It was the gross stuff. Fleshfly Larva. So Nirnroot is optional, but you do need Nightshade and Fleshfly Larva. Those are the two mandatory. Then anything else that has Ravage health in it will amplify this. Just make sure that no other additional status effects go on. So like if I had something else that had like Ravage health and increased weapon power, I would lose out on damage because every time you add on a status effect to a poison, all of the durations go down. So I usually stick with Nirnroot or Violet Caprinus. That's the cheaper option. Just make sure that it only has that Creeping Ravage health and the damage health on there. That'll do tons of damage, but again, it is very, very expensive, especially if you raid regularly or do dungeons regularly. So you can use that Absorb Stamina or Disease enchant if you want to save money, but do much less DPS. So that covered a lot of information, and I'll be having future builds talking primarily about like Nightblade in isolation. So like what sets work best for them, what is our rotation, stuff like that. This is more of just giving a debriefer, explaining where and when to use sets, what situations favor them, talking about trait changes, now that we're using poisons, the redistribution of power of Infused into Nirnhoned, stuff like that. And then in terms of CP, again, CP is a very open-ended system. There is no complete right answer until you get into the nitty-gritty min-maxing, looking at this class. They're playing with at least 80% weave potential. They're doing their rotation properly. So I'm not going to talk too much about the blue tree because, again, it changes for every class. It changes between players. Variables will change it. So if you're running Crags, you need less into piercing. If you're running Sharpened, you need less. So it's very versatile. So we'll talk more about that in the individual build videos. Otherwise, if I don't make a build video, I will be updating guides on Deltia's website again, much more rigorously, sorry, words, or regularly. That's the word I was looking for. Now that he's back. So if I don't make like a Stamsorg video and you're curious what the CP is, I will have that updated on his website within the next few weeks. But in terms of Green Tree, this is not optimal. So this is when you're trying to just do as much sustain on a target dummy as possible. You go 100 in tenacity and 100 into Mooncalf. However, you're hitting diminishing returns. This is very, very inefficient. As soon as you dodge roll or block mechanics in an actual dungeon, your stam sustain is going to suck. So usually what we'll be doing is bringing this to about 43 and 49. Because we heavy attack more, Mooncalf is really, really inefficient, so we get these about there, and then we start pumping points up into Warlord and Tumbling. So usually about 20% in Warlord, and then 20% into Tumbling. And then I usually put, where is it? Yeah, 20 into Shadow Ward for 9% cost of block, and then I also get that Treasure Hunter passive. If you want to take this to 10%, you can. And then you have like a free point, so you'll put that in sprinting. Otherwise, if you don't find yourself blocking too much, or you don't find yourself CC breaking too much, you can put points into sprinter and bashing focus. But this is usually what I do in terms of DPS, because break free happens a lot these days, especially in Halls of Fabrication or Asylum Sanctorum. You'll probably want a little bit more sprinting if you're doing something like Sanctum or fighting in really open areas. But then these are usually the things you're going to want to keep the same, and then Tumbling and Shadow Ward, especially Tumbling. Shadow Ward not so much, but Tumbling is really, really important. And then I also like to get that Treasure Hunter passive because I do like maximizing loot gain. And then in terms of red CP, pretty standard setup here, 49 Hardy and Ellie Defender, 61 Thick-Skinned and Ironclad. If you're doing a fight that doesn't have any direct damage, or like, let's say you're doing Rakat. Rakat is all magic damage in terms of a DPS. So Hardy is useless. So you're just going to take those points out and you're going to put him into Spell Shield because everything he does is magic damage. You have no need for it. So keep that in mind, that change your red CP based on the content you're doing. But usually this is the most versatile setup, and then 61 in Ironclad and Thick-Skinned. And then you have a 10 free points. Usually can do something like this. Just to get some extra damage mitigation from adds. If an add hits you with a lighter heavy attack, it'll deal less damage, but it won't really be too efficient unless you're in Maelstrom. And then a little bit of quick recovery, and then this will give you that nice passive that makes you take 15% less damage when rezzing a player. That really comes in handy these days with veteran content, because a lot of people die. It's really, really taxing, and it's hard to come back because a lot of times you're going to die when you're rezzing someone. So this is a really helpful passive to help kind of take off that bulk damage when you are leaving yourself vulnerable. So that covers a lot of CP. And then in terms of race, Khajiit is still really strong. However, Redguard will win in most situations now due to the Shadow nerf. This has been the same since Horns of the Reach went live. But Khajiit is still very, very strong. It does have the potential to beat Redguard in some situations, especially on a Nightblade or a Templar, where a lot of your damage comes from crits and crit hit damage because you have passives. So like the Nightblade has the Hemorrhage passive. Templars have Adric Spear. So Khajiit is still my personal favorite because it's just I like the looks of it. I like the damage. I really like crit, etc., etc. And then in a group, it gets even stronger with aggressive Warhorn and stuff like that. Otherwise, Redguard is still really strong. It's going to have the group scaling too, because aggressive Horn gives 10% stam. It's not going to stack with the Redguard stam, so it's not like some super bonus that you're gaining out of it, because they're additive, not multiplicative. But you will have better resource management, which is very, very important. So Redguard or Khajiit still going to be your best races in terms of PvE DPS. Imperial, Wood Elf, other stuff that's not min-max is still viable, but it will have a DPS deficit. But yeah, that covers a lot of the updates for stamina builds in Clockwork City. Still running 3 weapon damage on our jewelry. I was just doing some testing and keeping parameters constant and not having the heavy attack. Don't ignore, or just ignore that. But yeah, that covers pretty much everything. If you have comments or questions, leave them in the comment section below. I will be doing Magicka DPS next. Again, not too many massive changes, but again, since that change with the Maelstrom staff operating as an enchant, or as a set bonus instead of an enchant, that has had some cause and effect, some shifting of the puzzle pieces around in terms of what is most optimal in endgame PvE DPS. So we'll be having a shorter video about that, because it's a little less to talk about, because there's not as much differences of sets and so on. So look forward to that. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys around.